Welcome, everyone, to Your Vision, Your Vote, a program of Delaware's 2020 Millennial Summit. I'm Ralph Begleiter, your host for this second in a series of 3 election-related programs on Monday nights this week. Thanks to the Millennial Summit organization and to Delaware's Spur Impact for hosting these programs, and thank you for lighting up your computers again tonight to join us. People are beginning to turn their attention to the general election on November 3rd now. The coronavirus pandemic is significantly influencing the candidates' campaigns, and the pandemic could change the way we imagine elections in the United States. Tonight, I'm very happy to welcome Mr. Domenico Montanaro to our conversation. Domenico is the senior political editor and a Washington correspondent for National Public Radio. Previously, Domenico was deputy political editor for NBC News in Washington, where he wrote the network's first read political memo every day, and also appeared on MSNBC. He later was the chief political editor for the PBS NewsHour. Tonight, we're looking at the big national picture for the election of the presidency, but also for control of Congress. Phone's ringing.
Could be breaking news.
Breaking news. Before we get started tonight, I want to make a genuine public service announcement on behalf of the Millennial Summit and the American Association of Retired Persons, the AARP. Wait, what? What's the AARP doing here? They want to remind you that democracy is not a spectator sport. Here's a way you can get involved in nonpartisan politics. For generations now, American election polling places have been staffed by a lot of retirees, people who have more time available for public service and who have a demonstrated record of interest in politics. They sign people in at the polling places, check identification, run election booths and machines, and channel results to public officials. Because COVID-19 appears to threaten the lives of seniors, especially those with other underlying health conditions, elections officials everywhere, including here in Delaware, think many seniors will choose to stay away from the polls this year to protect themselves and others from infection. In Delaware, officials say they need more than 4,500 volunteer poll workers, even though they think many people will vote by mail. But the law says polling places must be open for those who choose to vote in person. So the Delaware Office of Elections is right now hiring paid poll workers to help assure that everyone who wants to vote can do so. You can do this, and I encourage you to do so. It's a great way to engage in public service while supporting democracy and learning about the voting process. To learn more, visit the website showing on your screen. To volunteer for these paid election jobs, you must be registered to vote in Delaware. You must attend just one training session, and they're available on evenings and weekends if that's more convenient for you. And of course, you must work on election day itself. Poll workers are needed for both Delaware's primary election on September 15th and for the general election on November 3rd. Most poll workers are paid $190 for their service. Some positions pay more. Find out more at Delaware Elections website on your screen, and do your part to support elections in Delaware, because democracy is not a spectator sport. Well, tonight with Domenico Montanaro, we're looking at the national political picture for the election of the presidency, but also for control of Congress. Because of the virtual nature of this program, we can't really tell who's in the audience, but we're steering our conversation for millennials and Gen Xers, and we're very glad to have everyone who's with us tonight. We're trying to keep track of the chat channel on the Facebook page, so please do feel free to post your thoughts and questions if you have some. But just in case we get overwhelmed, I won't make any promises about trying to address everything that appears in the chat. Well, Domenico, welcome to the program. And I think probably it's a good idea for you to start off by taking a look at the overall state of the election. Knowing that public opinion polls are just a snapshot of where things stand right now, let's talk about where things do stand right now.
Well, after you read my intro, everybody's asleep. So let's try to look a little bit, I guess. But, you know, the first thing that I think a lot of people should look at when you think about a presidential election, especially in a re-election, is how's the president doing? So we look at Trump's approval rating, and, you know, he's not doing very well. And not only is he not doing very well, you know, kind of in the same way that he's been doing throughout the first 3 years of his presidency, what the number that I think is really important to look at is how many people strongly disapprove of this president. Right now, we saw in our latest poll, 49% of Americans strongly disapprove of the job the president is doing. I mean, that's historic by any nature. Since polling began, no president has seen that kind of intense opposition than this president. And this is coming all in the midst of coronavirus and the pandemic and the president's handling of that, which is getting terrible marks. He's, up around 56, 57% disapproval in the average of the polls, 67% in the latest Ipsos poll disapproving of his handling of the coronavirus pandemic. And that's to say nothing of how people are disapproving of his handling of race relations while Black Lives Matters protests have been going on to protest racism. And, this president in many ways feels out of step with where the current nature of the country is headed. We had 2/3 of people in our poll, in the NPR PBS NewsHour Marist poll, tell us that they felt that he was fanning the flames after the George Floyd incident in Minneapolis, where he was killed by police. And, whether or not he can win an election that way, we've seen a real cratering in the suburbs from this president. And that's a big, big problem for him. And, you hear it from a lot of Republicans down ballot, people who are running House races, running Senate races, how they just feel like he's putting them on the defensive, especially in the suburbs. We saw it in 2018. You had women really fuel the 2018 House takeover for Democrats. Now if you have African Americans really plugged in and fired up and charged up to be in this election, those are two key pillars for Democrats to be able to try to beat President Trump this November.
Domenico, take a look at the trend here. I think is interesting to look at too. The president's Trump approval ratings have been pretty steady since the fall of last year, and it's all across the board. But during the pandemic period is when we've seen the remarkable shift in his support.
That red line people should see is how strongly people disapprove of the job he's doing. So you're talking 49% of people strongly disapproving. 40 was high. I mean, for a president to have 40% strongly disapprove, like you see back in November of 2019, and that was pretty consistent for most of his presidency, for that to jump to 49% is just astronomical. And for it to be 58% overall disapproving of the job he's doing, he's got to convince a lot of people who think he's not doing a good job to vote for him. And that's a tough sell to make.
And it looks as well during the pandemic from this chart as though it's the dark green line. Those are people who strongly supported him. Yeah. And he appears to have lost a significant number of people who strongly supported him. Not so much wavering from those who approved, but from those who strongly approved.
Yeah, and I think what you can read into that is that those are likely soft Trump supporters who aren't, particularly pleased with how the coronavirus pandemic is going and how he's handling it. But if it were to level out, if things were to get better in some of these places where we're seeing spikes, then they'll probably return to the president. And that's when you talk to the people who run the Biden campaign, they'll say that the numbers are inflated right now for Biden, that Biden is, yes, he's ahead, but he's not as far ahead as some of the polls are showing, or where they don't anticipate he will be, especially in a place like Michigan, where we've seen polls have him up 14, 15, 16 points. Their campaign manager is pretty firm in saying that that's not a real number, that it's going to come back. But at the same time, Biden is still up. He's still well ahead in a place that he needs to flip. And you can see here, Biden up 52-44 in the head-to-head matchup. And that's our poll. Other polls have it further apart. The difference here is how many Republicans you survey versus how many Republicans you don't. That's a movable number, by the way, because sometimes what we've seen is a spike in independents over the last several years who are really Republican voters, but they don't want to say they're Republicans. But we know that they lean Republican. So you'll see this outsized Democrat to Republican ratio in some of these polls, but that's a movable number. And these numbers are tried to be matched to the census figures. But these are snapshots. These are not to be predictive. And I think that it should just generally, people look at the trend lines to realize that there's a margin of error in here, 3.5 percentage points. And what that means is that the lead could be, 5 or 4, or it could be 11 or 12. And I think that that's where that middle is what people should look at. And the middle has trended in Biden's favor over the last several months.
All right. Now, here's the point you were starting to talk about earlier, looking at suburban voters, and maybe talk a little bit about this. Here are suburban men in the NPR poll.
Yep.
Right. And you're seeing a fairly close race. Probably, I don't know what the margin of error was on this poll, but it's probably pretty close to the margin of error. Right?
This is a national poll. When you have a subgroup, it's going to be a slightly higher margin of error. So you've got probably a margin of error of like 7 or 8 or 9%, probably.
Now, here's what you were talking about earlier. This is suburban women.
I mean, it's a stunning number. I mean, for Joe Biden to have a 30-point lead, essentially, with suburban women, it's the ball game, honestly. I mean, President Trump won suburban voters overall by 4 points in 2016. And in our poll overall, when you combine these two numbers, Biden is up 60-35 with suburban voters. If that number is real and those voters stay that way and they don't come around, it's going to be very difficult for Republicans to take back control of the House, where they really should be able to make inroads, because so many of those districts lean toward Republicans, or center-right districts that Democrats were able to make inroads on. But you can't make it up without those suburban women in particular. They are engaged, they vote, and right now they're voting Democrat.
Okay. You highlighted another particular point in a different poll by Monmouth University that applies to the question of the incumbent president's credibility and the Republican Party's polling public opinion messages that they've been sending out. And the question was asked about, when you hear people say they want to defund police, do you think most of them really want to get rid of police departments, or do you think mostly they want to change the way the police departments operate? And of course, in the last several weeks, the Republicans have been posting ads to the effect that defund the police means getting rid of police departments. And here's what the Monmouth University poll found. This is also a national poll. And again, Domenico, this is an overwhelming result. It's not a close call, right?
It's really stunning to me, because a phrase like defund the police is something that a lot of Democratic strategists just held their breath and said, what are you doing? Like, this is way too far. And they felt like they had to explain. They wanted a better slogan. They thought that this would poll really terribly. And what's happened is that we've seen people are actually very engaged and have listened to what people are actually protesting. And they don't see this phrase, defund the police, in the way Republicans want them to see it, to mean getting rid of the police departments. What they do see it as here, 3/4 of people think that they should change the way police operate. And that is a really stunning shift. It's a sea change from the 1960s. Ralph, you weren't born yet, but but you know what I mean. Back then, there were majorities who felt that the protests and civil rights protests would hurt African Americans' cause for equality. That's not what we're seeing now. It's a totally different time, and yet President Trump is continuing to do things like today tweet silent majority, which is a throwback to a Nixon phrase to say that there are white people in this country who don't like what's happening, that there are too many minority rights, and that they're the ones who are going to come out and vote, even if you're not hearing from them right now. This is not a margin of error number. And it's really a stunning one if we see that takes place with other polls.
All right, Domenico, let's get to, now this is your analysis as a professional analyst of national politics, of where do we stand today and what are the roads to success for Joe Biden and Donald Trump in the November election.
I think the official phrase for professional watcher of politics is geek.
Well, don't geek out too much on us tonight.
Look, you can see here this map I've taken from the website called 270 to Win, because they do a really good job of letting you click through and make maps. 270 to Win is called that because it takes 270 electoral votes to win the presidential election. Hillary Clinton won the popular vote by 3 million votes and lost because she lost by 78,000 votes between Wisconsin, Michigan, and Pennsylvania. If she were to have held Wisconsin, Michigan, and Pennsylvania with everything else that she won, she would have gotten to 270 and would have held and would have won. But Donald Trump was able to pick off all three of those. Joe Biden, if he were to get nothing else, would have to win all three of Wisconsin, Michigan, and Pennsylvania to be able to win again. But he also has other paths to the presidency, going through Florida, going through Arizona, new on the map, Arizona this time, and a place like Texas, where most Democrats, would never have thought that could be a possibility. I still don't think it's a place where this time around it's going to be a state Biden can win, but it's close enough right now that Republicans are going to have to spend money to hold it.
All right, let's go. Let's go through your scenarios. Let's start with. There's the Texas. Sorry.
Yeah.
There's the Texas. Shows how close it is.
We had a poll that came out this week that showed Biden actually up 46-41 in Texas, a Dallas Morning News poll. The one thing about that's unbelievable as far as you haven't seen that in a presidential election. It's a place that a Democrat hasn't won since Carter in '76, and yet you have Biden competing, not only competing but winning. And what we've seen in this, though, to really look at this, is independents have been very soft toward Donald Trump. They've disagreed with him on almost everything he's done this presidency, except on the push for impeachment. They thought that may have gone too far. But on almost every other policy issue, independents have been siding with Democrats. In Texas, a lot of those independents are in that undecided category. And those are probably soft Republicans who will probably go back to Trump. And 46 does not win an election. You've got to get to 50. So 50 is a really important number. When you see Biden eclipsing 50 in states, then that's something that the Trump campaign is exceedingly worried about. And he's doing that nationally. And what Texas is the leading indicator of, most likely, is difficulties that Trump is having in a place like Arizona and in a place like Florida, with older voters concerned about coronavirus, and not pleased with how Trump has handled it. All of this is intertwined. But because Texas is so many electoral votes and Republicans are going to have to spend money on it, even a 52-47 win for Trump in Texas, which is very, very close, he's going to have to spend millions upon millions upon millions of dollars, because Texas is a humongous state with some of the biggest media markets in the country.
And a lot of media markets, too. It's spread out, so they're going to
have a place like Dallas, Houston. These are emerging metropolitan areas. Dallas, Fort Worth area, I think, is the fastest growing metropolitan area over the last 10 years.
All right, let's move on to your scenarios for what, how it might play out. And there are several different ways, obviously.
So here we look at what I call the defend and hold. And this is Trump's path. Okay. How does he win? He wins what he won last time. He's, has the 36 electoral vote cushion to start with and a few states to play with, as I note here. He could lose, again, if we started in the upper Midwest, he could lose Wisconsin and Michigan. Even if Biden were to win Pennsylvania, it wouldn't be enough, okay? Trump could lose Pennsylvania and Michigan and still win. You can see there where he'd be over 270. He could lose Florida and still win, as long as he holds all the other places that he held last time. So, if you go through this scenario, you start clicking around, you see what it is, but you see that once some of those states start getting ticked off, a place like Florida, a place like Arizona, a place like Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, Michigan, if those places start to go, Trump's path becomes exceedingly narrow.
Move on to other possibilities.
So I call this the Trump expand and blowout. So this is the least likely scenario right now because Trump is struggling. He may be at the nadir of his political power at this point, but if he were to recover and were to be able to expand, look, Minnesota, for example, was within 2 points, 1.5 or 1.7 percentage points is all Hillary Clinton won it by. New Hampshire was within 3,000 votes. You turn out some people and he could win there. Hold in Arizona, which has been traditionally Republican. Hold in Florida, which went to a Republican governor and Senate in 2018. Hold Texas, even though it might be closer. Hold North Carolina, which has been a Republican state for some time. This is not inconceivable. However, Minnesota, Wisconsin, Michigan, Pennsylvania, Arizona have all started to trend Democratic. And by the way, President Trump has not led in a single poll in Florida since Joe Biden won the nomination.
Here's the opposite scenario.
Yeah, and then we get into this Biden blowout, which is also completely possible. Biden wins the entire upper Midwest, rebuilds that blue wall, so to speak, expands into places like Iowa and Ohio, where President Trump right now not doing very well. His approval rating is underwater. And if that were to continue and Democrats were to put even just a little bit of money into Iowa, you could see the possibility of it starting to move that direction. If Iowa and Ohio are places we are talking about in October, that is a problem for President Trump. Nevada, New Hampshire, these are places where, frankly, I didn't have them as lean Democrat, but they very well may be right now because Biden's not only doing well in the polls, Democrats have done well. Democrats have both congressional seats and Senate seats in New Hampshire. There's a great operation in Nevada that Harry Reid still controls, the former Democratic majority leader. And really, most of the vote in Nevada comes from the southeastern part of the state where Las Vegas and Henderson are, the suburban area outside of Las Vegas. 2/3 of the vote in the state comes from that small area. So it's very easy to organize when you have a small area. Arizona, another place where Democrats are feeling pretty good, especially about their chances in the Senate. You've got an astronaut, Mark Kelly, husband of Gabby Giffords, who had been shot years ago during a campaign event when she was a congresswoman. And he's been leading in the polls. He's out fundraised Martha McSally, who's the incumbent Republican senator. And frankly, we could see an up ballot effect where you have a senator pull over some Democratic votes for Joe Biden. If Kelly right now is out polling Joe Biden, and if Kelly wins this thing by 9-10 points, Biden could easily win it by 4 or 5. And you can see that. And look, 11 electoral votes. Suddenly that subs out Wisconsin. You don't need a Wisconsin if you can win in Arizona. You start to balance that out. Florida, Georgia, Georgia is probably a long shot still, but it is a state that has come, for as Republican as the state is, Atlanta has exploded. It has become a hub for young African Americans heading into Atlanta. And there have been a ton of people who've come from the Northeast to work in areas outside of Atlanta for some big corporation jobs. So there's been huge growth, huge demographic change. Whether Democrats can get over the hump in that state is something we haven't seen so far.
So just to be clear for people who are watching this, is you're not making this prediction,
No.
what we're seeing on the screen now, you're not predicting a Biden blowout, but you're illustrating how it might come about if it were to come about. And I guess the other caveat would be, the other caveat would just be that it's a snapshot. It's only, sorry, go ahead, Domenico.
No, I said this is actually me completely hedging my bets. I'm giving you all the scenarios.
Right. Okay, fair enough. And the other thing just everybody should remember is these are snapshot ideas. This is the way it's, it could stand at any given moment, but you still got 3.5 months to go. Keep going.
So again, we talked a little bit about the blue wall. So this is rebuild that blue wall. Joe Biden can win in the upper Midwest, Wisconsin, Michigan. Pennsylvania, I put as part of it. People will argue that it's not a Midwestern state, but it's certainly a Rust Belt state. And I agree with that. So, those 3 states have a lot in common as far as old union manufacturing jobs that have left. There's a lot of populism in those places that clearly President Trump was able to appeal to folks on. I called it my trade win scenario in 2016. President Trump was able to capitalize on that kind of populism to bring those jobs back. he is suffering politically. That narrative has not sold in Wisconsin, Michigan, and Pennsylvania. His approval rating is severely underwater in those places. And if Biden can just hold those three places, not win Arizona, not win Florida, not win North Carolina, and win everything else Hillary Clinton won, he would win. He'd get over the hump. He'd get 278 electoral votes.
Just want to recall something you said earlier in this program while we have it on the screen. Pennsylvania is one of the states which Donald Trump won by a very small number of votes. I've forgotten the number, something like 11,000 or something like that in Pennsylvania. And that was also true for Wisconsin and Michigan, two other states that in this scenario you've put in Biden's category.
So
but
the thing a lot of people like to say is that Wisconsin, all the voters, the margin of the vote, 77,000 votes between Wisconsin, Michigan, and Pennsylvania could all fit inside, the Michigan football stadium.
Okay. So small number of votes was the margin he had, Trump had in 2016. So it's not inconceivable that margin could flip by a small number of votes this time as well.
Right.
All right, let's move on to your next scenario.
So here's the one to give everyone agita, a tie. So if you want the election, we should all be prepared, by the way, for the fact that the election will likely not be decided on election night if it's close because of the number of mail-in ballots that are likely to come in. You'll have people vote on election day, certainly, but we're going to see a record number of people voting by mail. And remember, in a lot of places, those mail-in ballots just have to be postmarked by election day. And we know that that'll take a couple days before it gets in and gets counted. But we could see a tie. This is a very plausible scenario where if Biden were to win Pennsylvania and Michigan and hold everything else Hillary Clinton held and lose Wisconsin, which is the most conservative of those three states, the most Republicans, the highest number of Republicans to Democrats, you'd be at 269 to 269. And that would turn us into a constitutional crisis. And you would see the election thrown to the House, and likely the Republican would win out because of the makeup of all of the states and how Republicans control a majority of the overall number of elected officials in federal elected officials in those states.
Domenico, has that happened before in the history of the United States? I don't think so.
Think so. We haven't had it. I don't quote me on that. I should know that. That's a.
Sorry, didn't mean to put you on the spot.
No, I'm really puzzled over it because it hasn't been a 269. We haven't had that since it's gone to 538. But you never cross things out that could have happened in the 1800s.
Okay, all right. Other scenarios, other ways the election could go.
So I call this chasing the Sun Belt, and that's if Biden were to win in a place like Nevada, Arizona, Georgia, North Carolina, Florida. Those are places that are emerging, demographically changing places. Big number of Latinos who've come into a lot of those states, African Americans who've moved and into Georgia, but even Latinos, big numbers of Latinos who've moved into Georgia. The big question I have is how do you register a lot of the people who they would need to register, who may not have been engaged in politics previously, who are showing us why a state like Texas, by the way, is majority minority but there's a lot of Latinos who are not registered to vote. Arizona, huge number of Latinos who are not registered to vote. Nevada, same thing. How do you get those people to be registered if you can't door knock because of coronavirus? It's a very difficult thing that a lot of both Democratic and Republican strategists are really puzzling over. They're really struggling over how to do it. Do you just reach them digitally? There's a lot of concern over how to reach people digitally because of what happened with the Trump campaign in 2016. So there's going to be political science papers written about this election, just as far as organization goes, out the wazoo. So that's a huge, when I talk about the importance of the Sun Belt, Georgia and North Carolina, if Biden were to win Arizona and North Carolina or Georgia, he could lose Pennsylvania and Wisconsin and still win. You'd have to do those numbers to look at what I'm saying here. But that second chart, you can see Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, all red. But because Biden wins Arizona and North Carolina, he's over 270. So Biden has many paths to the nomination, but it's a big, number of states, and their campaign is having to figure out where to use a limited number of resources to make the biggest impact.
It's possible, I suppose, that the coronavirus situation could make it easier the candidate wouldn't necessarily have to fly to all those places, and you don't have to make all those arrangements, right?
Yeah. And I think people have probably gotten used to Zoom by now and StreamYard, to be able to hear what candidates' messages are. The other thing is here, there aren't a lot of undecided people when it comes to President Trump or Joe Biden. Joe Biden is very well known. He has very high name ID. And so is President Trump. And people have very strong feelings about President Trump in particular. And elections are always, re-elections are always referenda on the sitting president.
All right, let's go to your number 6 scenario.
So I call this Florida +1. Tim Russert, who I used to work for, used to say Florida, 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 and that still holds. This is a state that has been very, very close in a number of elections since 2000 and before that. And look, if Biden were to win Florida and its big chunk of electoral votes, all he would need is one more of those states, and he's over the top. He could win Michigan, which is the most likely one to flip right now, even more so than Pennsylvania. And you see that he's over the top with 277, even if Trump were to win Pennsylvania, even if he were to win Arizona, North Carolina, Georgia, Wisconsin. So you start to see how important Florida is, and just how important in particular it is to President Trump.
So in this chart, the top map is the one that shows Trump winning by a hair, exactly, and the bottom map shows Biden winning by a hair. And you can see the two maps really don't differ very, very much, and that's what you're talking about with Florida going one way. Either candidate could still win the election depending on what happens, essentially.
But it would be, that's why I call it the Florida +1, because in that top map, it's Florida with none of the other states that Trump had won in 2016 that Biden's able to pick off. And in the bottom, it's with Michigan.
Right. Okay, there you go. All right. And let's see. Oh, I guess that's it. We can take the slides off now, I guess. That's right. Cool. So the bottom line on these scenarios is that if somebody walks up to you and says, who's going to win the election? What do you say?
I never answer that question, Ralph. Even when my parents ask me, I'm always like, I can't do that, I would say that
I'm not asking you for a prediction because I understand you.
But what I would say is that any objective observer of this, and this, remember, my map is not based on just polls. It's based on historical trends, demographic data, and, by the way, our anecdotal reporting. If I were just basing this map on polls, Texas would be a toss-up, if not a lean, to Biden, given what we just saw. But given the historical trends and patterns, that's not where it's at. It's a lean Republican state, in my view. But what I would say is that right now, clearly Biden has the advantage. The work has to be done. People still have to obviously vote. And that was the same situation in 2016. I mean, just remember, Hillary Clinton had the advantage. The Trump campaign expected that she was going to win, but people have to show up and vote. And the kinds of people who she needed to show up and vote didn't vote, or registered a protest vote and voted third party in key places. So, every Democratic strategist, every Republican strategist expects and is planning for a close, very close, tight election. But, right now it's hard not to say Biden doesn't have the advantage. I think a lot of people are expecting that Trump will bounce back some because this looks like the nadir for him. And, there's still 4 months to go.
I just want to remind people watching that you're welcome to ask questions. If you use the chat room, we'll take a note of it, and you can ask questions of Domenico as well. In fact, here's a question from Brandon Witt right now. How do you see not knowing who wins the election for days? I think Brandon is talking about the
on election day
point you mentioned earlier, which is we're not going to have the results of the election overnight the way we've been accustomed to in the past.
I think it's going to be a disaster. I mean, I think it's going to be an absolute unmitigated 24-hour cable news disaster. You know, you used to work in that area and you know what it's going to be like. There's not two of us on two boxes. It's going to be 16 people in boxes with no idea what they're really talking about because none of us do. None of us will have the data. We won't have the information. We won't know how many votes are in or not. And this has never happened before. So you're going to have a lot of people saying the wrong thing, making a lot of predictions, and getting way out over their skis because that's what sells. Like conviction on television is the most important thing. I mean, you want to be right? But you have to have conviction to be able to get out there. And I think that people just need to pump the brakes. They need to just realize that they have to be patient, that we're not going to know everything on election night, and we just have to wait, and there are very good statisticians, people should understand, who work for the news networks, for CNN, NBC, ABC, Fox. Fox has a very good decision desk. They're very good statisticians, very good pollsters, and they're constantly pressing the brakes on people at the networks to say, hold on, don't go too far here. And I think that those news executives and analysts would be well served to listen to them this time around, to just be cautious about any predictions.
Let me try something out on you in that connection. In the past, on election night, people who worked at the networks would be looking at where the votes are coming in, this precinct or this neighborhood or this part of Detroit or whatever, right? And on the basis of past voting history, you could make some intelligent projections. You could say, well, when this part of Detroit comes in, it isn't in yet, but when it comes in, it's very likely to go this way or that way. What's different about mail balloting is that you can't even make those projections because you don't know where the mail ballots are coming from or where they're missing from or anything of that sort.
Well, what they will know is how many mail ballots are out. And what they'll know is how many have come back. So they'll know a percentage.
They won't know the demographics from where they're coming, right?
Right. They'll only have the Democratic versus Republican information, most likely. I think it's going to be very complicated. I think that, the places that will say with 0% reporting that they've made a call, those are never usually the ones that are wrong because they're exceedingly partisan areas. We also have a new situation this time around in 2020 where Fox and the Associated Press have broke off of the traditional exit poll consortium. This is run by a group called Edison Research. They've been doing this since the 1970s, and they had traditionally gotten involved with the big media companies who pay them to basically send people out to where people are voting, and they pick basically every fourth person in line, and they ask them, how'd you vote? And they give them a whole questionnaire. They give it back to them. The problem is there have been some bias in the reporting. We found that a lot more Republicans are wary of things that say New York Times on it or CBS News or NBC or whatever. And there's been a little bit of oversampling of Democrats. They've tried to adjust for that. And they've made some changes to go into 2020 because their customers weren't that happy. And you had two big ones break off. What AP and Fox are doing, they're not doing exit polls, they're doing entrance polls. So they are actually surveying, just doing big surveys, big polls on the phone and in person in some cases, maybe 3,000, 3,500 people before they vote to ask them what they're going to do. Now, the problem with that is people can change their mind when they go in. But polls in general, they're pretty good, especially when you have a huge number like that. Think about a national poll, usually about 1,000 people, and you get about 3.5% margin of error on those. You triple that and do it in a state, you're shrinking the margin of error quite a bit. And as long as you're, waiting for all of the things you need to wait for, race, demography, place, you can get pretty darn close. Except when it's really, really close.
Domenico, we've got a couple more questions from people in our audience. Michelle is asking, what about the anti-votes? That is, people who are who are specifically going to the poll and casting a vote against the other candidate, not necessarily because they like the one they're voting for, but because they don't like the one they're not voting for. Is there a different dynamic this year in that connection, or about the same as 2016? What's your feeling about anti-votes?
The difference from 2016 is that Trump is president now. I mean, breaking news, I know, but the election is about him, much more so than in 2016, when it was a question of who would you rather have, Trump or Clinton, and there were all these mixed feelings about each person and everything like that. There is now 3+ years of the Trump presidency that people have very strong feelings about. Some people absolutely love the guy, and overwhelmingly his supporters say they're going to the polls to cast a ballot for him. Biden voters are overwhelmingly saying they're going to the polls to cast a vote against Trump, not necessarily for Biden. Now, you could look at that and say that's bad for Biden, but at the end of the day, it's a vote about Trump, and it's just what it is. And if we didn't think it was about him, and it's about him and how his approval rating is going, how people think the economy is doing, whether they think they're better off than they were 4 years ago, whether their kids are getting back to school and school reopenings are being handled correctly.
And the pandemic, yeah, right.
Things between now and November.
Right. Okay, another question that's popped up is from Sarah, who's asking whether you think we'll see more efforts in Georgia this year to purge voter rolls in the fall election, something that we saw in 2018. Will that happen again this year? And might it happen in other states as well?
Yeah, probably. I mean, I think that in places that are controlled by folks who want to purge voter rolls and clean them up, in their view, they will do so, and do so aggressively if they feel that, they can, and frankly benefits them politically. There's nothing stopping them from doing that. And, there's a huge effort to monitor that. We have an election security team that monitors a lot of that and shedding light on what happens. Certainly a lot of people, when it disproportionately affects people of color, feeling like that is voter suppression, that they're affecting people who can't get ID more easily, people who don't have as much money. This is it's going to be a constant battle, especially because these elections are run not federally, not in a centralized way, but state to state.
Domenico, I want to, we haven't really touched on this much. I think you made a passing reference very early on in the program, but I want to spend a few minutes talking about control of Congress.
Yeah.
Because the election, while of course the headline is all about the presidency, I think it's arguably the case this year that control of Congress is as big a headline, or almost as big a headline this year. So talk for a minute about, let's do the House and the Senate separately. What do you think? How likely is it that the House could switch sides? The Republicans could take the House. How likely is it the Democrats will increase their control of the House? The dynamics of the House elections this year.
Well, just from the projections that are being made, it looks like Democrats are likely to keep the House. They're likely to retain the House, if not expand. They have the chance to actually increase by 4 or 5 seats, which is really crazy because the 40 seats they picked up were in pretty Republican places. But again, when we saw those numbers with women, suburban women, I mean, you cannot win in those right-leaning suburban districts if you're 30 points underwater with suburban women. And that is driving Republican campaign managers out of their minds right now because they're not able to separate themselves from Trump's message. And, if Trump can't do better than that in the suburbs, then it's unlikely that Republicans will be able to take back the House. Things can change, but that's what the projections are right now. If you read the Cook Political Report, which does a lot of this, or the Rothenberg Political Report, 2 very good publications. That's where things are expected to be right now in the House, Ralph.
Does the suburban women issue that you've raised tonight also affect the Senate races, or is it not as much of a factor in control of the Senate? And talk a little bit about prospects for control of the Senate, which is controlled right now by a Republican majority, albeit a very narrow majority.
Oh yeah, I think absolutely they affect some of these Senate races, excuse me. Right now, what we're seeing is there are 5 Republican incumbents who are considered to be in toss-up races. And those are in places like Arizona, Colorado, Maine, and a few other places. Those are all places with significant suburban populations. Colorado in particular, boy, that makes life very difficult for Cory Gardner, who's the incumbent Republican there. And they were hoping, Republicans were hoping they would get a different candidate than who wound up winning, John Hickenlooper, who's the former governor and a pretty centrist guy. Not a great campaigner. You saw him on the presidential campaign. He's a little weird, kind of awkward guy, and he acknowledges that. But now that he's through his primary and has raised a significant amount of money, now Democrats are focusing on Gardner. And what people have to realize is that Colorado has been a state that hasn't been a swing state since Bush won re-election in 2004. That's a long time now in political, years. And you're going to have to get a certain number of people, if you're Cory Gardner, to vote for you and Joe Biden, if Biden winds up winning Colorado. So that's really hard to do. That's hard to do in a lot of places. And, so you look at a place like that, you look at Maine, where Susan Collins has been there a long time. She has gotten severely out fundraised by the Democratic candidate. The likely Democratic candidate tomorrow night is the primary in Maine. I mean, Sarah Gideon has raised a ton of money, and Democrats are aiming for Susan Collins. Mostly because she used to play this sort of moderate centrist role, and her role in the Kavanaugh hearings, where she really took his side and kind of put it over the edge, has really irritated, a lot of women, suburban women in particular, and Democrats who are very willing to open their pocketbooks.
Just quickly tick off, you've mentioned Maine, you've mentioned Colorado, tick off the other states that the rest of us ought to be looking at, paying attention to in terms of Senate races for places that could be bellwethers of which way control of the Senate will go.
Yeah, so like I said, there's 5 states where Republicans are considered toss-ups. I'm just going to pull up my story here that I wrote yesterday to see. Arizona, Colorado, Maine, Montana, North Carolina. So what's really interesting about that is Montana is not a place that most people would think of as being a Democratic potential takeover, but they've got a popular governor who's running for the Senate race, and Steve Bullock, who some people may remember from running in the presidential race. And he's raised a significant amount of money, and he's gotten good marks for his handling of the coronavirus during this entire thing. So he's doing quite well. He's led in the latest polls. He's running against Steve Daines, who has been an incumbent there for a little bit. And North Carolina, Tom Tillis has raised a good amount of money, but so has Cal Cunningham, who has come on pretty strong in the state. So, and again, it's gonna be like, as North Carolina or as the presidential race goes, so might go a state like North Carolina in the Senate race. Then there's 2 races in Georgia that are lean Republican right now, where David Perdue and Kelly Loeffler are both up for election.
That's unusual, right? Why did that happen? Why?
Very unusual. One of them is a special election, where Loeffler was appointed to the seat and is now up for election after that. So, she has a primary opponent, though, from Doug Collins, who's, got some fame from the impeachment hearings, or not the impeachment hearings, from the Ukraine House hearings. So he was a very strong defender of President Trump, although Trump has backed Loeffler in that race. And then Iowa, which has come on really surprisingly, Democrats like their candidate there, Teresa Greenfield, and she's running against Joni Ernst, and also raised a significant amount of money. So, and Kansas, like most people would not think of Kansas, but Democrats just won the Kansas race for governor. And the candidate there, Barbara Bollier, she is running in this open seat. She's raised $7 million already in Kansas, has $4 million cash on hand, while Republicans are duking it out. And Chris Kobach is someone who's hoping to win that race. He's a guy who's gotten known for his hard right views on immigration, worked with President Trump on some of that. And, you know, if he winds up winning that primary, Democrats are very optimistic about winning in Kansas. And so that's a significant number of races. Meanwhile, the Republican targets, they only have two. They only have two targets, Alabama and Michigan. Alabama, that race with Doug Jones, remember, he wound up winning because Roy Moore had run and some of his extreme views wound up hurting him. But Jones has raised a good amount of money, and he's going to put up a fight. But Michigan is the other race, the only other one where there's a Democratic incumbent senator, and that's Gary Peters, who's also raised a significant amount of money against a Republican candidate that they really like, John James, who's raised, like I said, a ton of money as well. But, you know, those aren't two places where they seem very competitive right now. Instead, you have Democrats who are doing most of the targeting.
Domenico, I think everybody understands the stakes are very high for the presidential race. Are the stakes high? What are the stakes this year for control of Congress, and why will control of Congress this year make a difference in a way that is different from the past, or has it always been about the same as it's going to be this year?
I always say that you have to have numbers if you want to get legislation done. All this stuff about kumbaya and going out to dinner with each other and, you know, maybe being able to work across party lines, that stuff is like fantasy. And I think always was fantasy in Washington, to be totally honest. The only reason why LBJ was able to get as much as he was able to get done is because he was a Democrat, and the Southern Democratic Party was a whole lot different than it is today. And he was able to sway a lot of those people. It's not because he had this, like, you know, he was dubbed the master of the Senate, but without being a Southern Democrat himself, he would have never been able to get Southern Democrats on board for things like the civil rights legislation. And it's why a lot of people thought that the only way immigration reform was going to get passed was if George W. Bush was able to get it passed, because Republicans brought it over the finish line. And you have a Texas governor, a border governor, be able to sell Republicans on pushing immigration reform. That didn't happen. And we've seen it hasn't been able to happen since. The only way something is going to get passed is with numbers. And let me just point out, in 2018, I watched a lot of liberals upset that people like Stacey Abrams lost the governorship in Georgia, and Andrew Gillum, who knows if you wanted him to win, lost as the governor in Florida. Okay, what mattered was the House. President Trump has been able to get zero goose egg done since Nancy Pelosi took over control of the agenda in the House. Unless you control all three chambers nowadays in Washington, you're going to get squat done. Maybe very small things around the edges, but it's hugely important for there to be full control to be able to get anything done in a significant way. And still, with the filibuster in the Senate, it makes it very, very difficult. You have to be able to leverage pressure on those wavering from one side or the other to be able to get them to realize they need to support some of that legislation because it would help them politically. That's where these guys all think, and gals. It's, can I win? Will I win if I vote on this, or will I lose? That's what it all comes down to. And I should point out, if Joe Biden were to win, Democrats need 3 seats to flip 3 seats. If Joe Biden were to lose and President Trump were to win re-election, Democrats need to net 4 seats, because a tie would mean Vice President Mike Pence would break any tie.
We only have a couple of minutes left in the program, but I want to make sure that we don't miss the opportunity to talk about the role of local elections and state elections this year. Yeah. Perhaps because of the pandemic, and we've seen unfolding in the last 4 or 5 months, kind of devolution of political power to the states and state officials, and not necessarily just governors, but all kinds of, state health officials and other kinds of state officials have wielded power in ways during the pandemic that you wouldn't normally expect. So maybe a word or two from you about the role or the importance of state and local elections this year.
Yeah, everybody pays attention to the presidential race, but so much of what can be affected, so much of how change can actually happen is locally. I mean, you can make that change in your community. You can make that change, in your city council and in your schools. I mean, I just think about, we haven't talked very much about Black Lives Matter and some of the protests, but think about where some of the concrete changes have been made. If you're waiting for federal change, it's going to take a very long time to be able to get some of these senators and House members on board for the kinds of policies that are wanted. But we've seen already communities taking action when the federal government won't. And the reason they do that is because of pressure inside those communities. Even if you're in a place where, there's only a few hundred people, if 50 people have gone out to a protest or 50 people show up with the same message to a town hall meeting, I've been in those local municipal town hall meetings when everybody feels strongly about one thing. What do those mayors and city councilmen want? They want you to get off their back and stop pressuring them, right? But if you're there and you're talking and they're listening to you, you can get changes done at your local level. I mean, I think about with Black Lives Matter, a lot of Black alumni, for example, who have been dispirited with the curriculum in their schools or their high schools, private and public, about Black history not being included as strongly, have now been signing a lot of petitions and gotten more than just statements from schools, but commitments to changing their curriculum.
Domenico, I can say this because I'm an old white man. We've got two candidates running for president this year who are both old white men. One of our viewers earlier had asked the question, are we going to get to a point at some point where the candidates for president in the United States, and for that matter, for members of the Senate especially as well, are not old white men, are going to reflect some diversity of the country that you talked about much earlier in this program?
I think it'll get there. I mean, obviously the millennial generation and the tail end of Gen X, where I am, we've been branded this weird cross-generation thing called Xennials. Some Australian professor came up with it because of our adaptation of technology. Whatever, I'll take it. But it is the most diverse generation. Right now, a majority of elementary school kids are non-white. And as that continues and the millennial generation and younger, Gen Z and more, become the majority, you're going to see the country more reflected in public office. I mean, think about women. I mean, gosh, this is 100 years since women have had the right to vote. They are 53% of the presidential elections in the last two elections. They're the majority of voters and not even close to a majority of elected officials. So there are a lot of groups who are far underrepresented in this country. And I think the generational change that we're seeing will mean more progressive politics, and it will mean more diversity.
All right. A closing note, you already pitched to millennials and Gen Xers to engage in civic activity. I'd like to echo that as well. Remind you of the pitch I made at the beginning of the program tonight. If you are a millennial or a Gen Xer and you would like to find a way to become civically engaged in this election, one way to do so is check in with the Elections Board, election commissioner here in Delaware, and find out whether you can volunteer to work in a paid volunteer position on election day to replace some of the retirees who may not show up at the polls because of the coronavirus pandemic. I'm afraid we're out of time for tonight's program, and I know some of you probably could talk with Domenico for a long time. I could, for sure, about the elections coming up, and maybe we'll have a chance to do it again sometime. But I want to thank you, Domenico Montanaro of NPR, for being with us tonight. You can hear him every day on National Public Radio, All Things Considered, or Morning Edition, and in various newscasts throughout the day. On behalf of Spur Impact and the Delaware Millennial Summit, thank you all for joining us. I'll be back next week with Peter Hamby, who's the news editor for Snapchat and a former CNN politics correspondent as well. I know you'll find him really interesting as we take a look at the media's role in the election. We had a few questions tonight from people in the audience about the media, but we'll deal with that at length next week. Until then, that's next Monday night, July 20th at 7:30 p.m. on the Millennial Summit Facebook page. Until then, good night, everybody.